Thank you very much, Professor Kapanga, my friend, for inviting me to speak here today on a subject that is very important and very close to me. What I will try and do is summarize my research because it is part of a larger project. What I have to say about Boilat is part of a larger project about early African writers. It asks questions such as, why did Africans start writing in French? Where does the idea of doing a book in French come from? What spurred the interest of African writers to write the earliest books in French? Merci. A subject like that cannot be treated briefly, and so I will try and limit my remarks to the specific case of Abbé Boilat, and within that emphasize a couple of points relative to African philosophy and African literature today. I hope that I can finish making my remarks at least 15 minutes before the time is up, so we could have some conversation here. I apologize for the delay. Abbé David Boilat was born in Saint-Louis du Senegal. Saint-Louis du Senegal, we say it that way because there are several cities called Saint-Louis around the world, not only in France, but also here in the US and other parts of the world. So we do like to add du Senegal to distinguish that city of Saint-Louis from other cities called the same, by the same name elsewhere in the world. He was born in Saint-Louis in the early 19th century of a Signard mother and a French father. The Signards were ladies of the city of Saint-Louis, many of whom were themselves of mixed blood, the African and European, in the 19th century. But they also became businesswomen. They were the pioneers of a certain form of Western capitalism on the African coast. Often, when white people came to do business in the colonial outposts, they could not speak the African languages. They often did not know how to treat their illnesses, if they had malaria, how to deal with it. Usually, they were not familiar with the food. So often, they sought the love, or in any case, the marriage of a local woman who was familiar with the Europeans and their ways, and who could serve as an intermediary, a facilitator. In effect, historians in the past 10, 12 years have uncovered a new development in the study of Signard work and culture. In effect, they were entrepreneurs in the earliest sense in the 19th century in West Africa. What they were doing was conducting business and making a partnership with the Europeans who came to buy such things as gum arabica, ivory, gold, leather, other products. That is at the time when Europeans became much more interested in the products of the African continent than in the slaves. So there was a shift in the interest. And these Signard women, who were quite creative, often helped the European capitalists do business on the coast, and they often shared in the profits. Many of them were very wealthy people. They had their own ships that would go, for instance, on the river Senegal from Saint Louis all the way down east to the border of Guinea, buying products which they brought back to Saint Louis, which then were transferred onto European vessels to be shipped to Europe. I had to say that because this new development opens new vistas into the lives of the Signars, that they were not confined to the role, to the domestic role, but in fact were creative businesswomen. Having said that, Boilat was born of one of these women, a Signard, and a European father, French, we think. We do not know for sure. We know his name, but his birth certificate could not be found because when he was born, the colony of Saint Louis was under the command of the British, who had chased the French out of there. And when the British left and the French regained control, the British took away all the papers that they had, including birth certificates of the people of the city of Saint Louis. Historians have been looking for these documents. I've been looking also, but we haven't found his birth certificate. What we have is an affidavit signed during his own lifetime by people who witnessed his birth and could testify to the date of his birth and his parents. In any case, Abbé Boilat had known to us only one brother who died very early as an infant. His father, his own father, died when he was very small. So therefore, he was trusted to the care of the sisters of the convent. There was one convent led by Mother Jahoufé, who created the first schools in Senegal. And they took care of him. At age 13, he was sent to France, along with 11 other young boys from different parts of Senegal, and I believe a couple from other parts of Africa, to study in a seminary and learn to become good missionaries so that they can return and evangelize and convert their people into Christianity. He received his degree, his diploma in France, and came back to Senegal that same year. Most of his friends did not get so lucky. They died. They died of the cold weather in France, which they were not used to. Some had tuberculosis and perished in France. About of the 12, maybe 4 came back alive, and he was one of the lucky 4. Boilat is very important in the history of Senegal, and as we shall see, in the history of Africa, for the work he has done. Yes, he was a missionary. He was a man of 2 loyalties. From the beginning, his loyalty was to the church. He had a mission to evangelize, to convert people in Senegal, and he did his level best to accomplish that. But also, he made a point of stating in his books, so that the other priests and missionaries would understand this, that he was not a stranger in the land, that this land was his country of birth. These people who speak are his people. He made it clear that people understood when he wrote a book on the grammar of the Wolof language, which to my knowledge was the full-fledged book on that language, that this language is not something that he has learned in adulthood. As he said, this language is la langue dans laquelle j'ai balbutié mes premiers mots, the language in which I have stuttered my first words as a child. So this is his mother tongue, to put it clearly. And he was determined to write the best book about it, to convey the full meaning, significance, and rich quality of the language in that book, and not to be discouraged by others who are also preparing books on the Wolof language, who may have held a higher rank than he did, either in the mission, in the church, or in the colonial administration. I say this because he will enter into sort of a muted competition with the governor of Senegal at the time, who had also written a book on another language, and they presented both books to the Société de Géographie, Société Royale de Géographie in Paris, and Boilat won the medal, the gold medal prize for the best book, the best grammar of an African language, and the governor did not. That did not please the governor. So he didn't make a friend there, to the contrary. But also he endeavored to remove from the cities of Saint-Louis and Gorée, and even parts of Dakar, which was then only a large village, this custom called mariage à la mode du pays. When the European traders came, they did not marry the women in church, nor did they practice their civil marriage. They arranged with the families to allow them to be with the women for a number of years, 3, 4, 5, until such time that they were ready to go back to Europe. And when they were ready to go to Europe, they just simply left. The children they had with the women had no rights to the inheritance of their fathers. The mothers were allowed to keep the house, but you have to admit it would be very hard for a European going back to Europe to drag his whole house back to France or Portugal or indeed to Britain. So that what they inherited was the house, but the children could not claim any part of the property of their father. Boilat thought this was a very unjust and immoral system, and he fought it. He fought it very hard. He gave sermons. He talked to families. And his campaign was received with a certain degree of anger by those people who he called les libertins, the libertines, the people who simply wanted to have fun and have a lot of sex and no consequences, no responsibilities. So there, he did not make friends. He made many enemies because they were determined to have him removed from the colony. These combined efforts succeeded in the end. Boilat was sent by his superiors back to France. He was in his 50s, to serve in a small parish in the region of Paris. And that's where he worked until his death and was buried right there. But before that, he had managed to write 2 very important books. One, Esquisse Sénégalaise, and as Professor just said, Senegalese Sketches, and the other one, Grammaire de la langue Wolof. The Senegalese Sketches are a better known book because they have been reissued. They were reissued in 1984, and that would be the 2nd edition of this book, which was written in 1853, excuse me, in the 19th century. But both are equally important in terms of African studies. What Boilat has brought in full view is that he considered Africans to be fully human. And in mid-19th century European thinking, that was a bold statement, because Africans were enslaved because they were thought to be inferior, not quite human, could be traded as chattel. If they were human, fully human like others, then they couldn't be bought and sold by Christian doctrine. So Boilat said, yes, he would go and evangelize and proselytize and try to convert people, but he admitted that these people were people just like you and I, and there was no difference. That statement was very important because it led to certain consequences. And one of these consequences was Boilat's work in the domain of education. Governor Schmaltz, who was the governor of Saint Louis before Governor Federbe, Louis Federbe, Schmaltz appointed Boilat the director or the chairman of education, sort of like a secretary of education in the colony. So he decided he would build schools for the boys, elementary, secondary level, and higher. But also he decided girls needed schools too. So he went on and created the first college for girls in Senegal, in Africa. We're talking about 19th century. That was controversial. A lot of people didn't like that. They suspected he was squandering the state's money, and the results were slim. And he counted that it takes time to give study habits to people who had not been in school. So this was important, his work in education. He was a pioneer. And he was a pioneer in education for all, boys and girls, equally. He told the young Senegalese that they were the young people of Saint Louis. You see, I say Senegalese, but Senegal really didn't exist then. In a sense, it was dreamt by Boilat in its current form. There's a map here that I will show you of what he imagined Senegal to be. And okay, that's good. Really, when Boilat was working and writing, the colony of Senegal was just that small town up there coming into to meet the ocean, La Langue de Barbarie. In the middle of it is an island called Saint Louis. This was the extent of the French colony of Saint Louis. But Boilat traveled throughout Senegal, visited many parts, north, south, east, west, and wrote about the people who inhabited in these different parts, and drew a map. This is, in fact, really a map of his own travels. By the end of the 19th century, Louis Federbe had managed to subdue much of the resistance in many of these parts of Senegal and folded them in the French colony of Senegal. So it took a long time, but he had a vision of the people. L'abbé Boilat was also, unlike most European travelers who wrote books about Africa in the 19th century, convinced that Africans had not only a culture but a civilization. This was another bold move of his. The word civilization in Africa did not mix in the 19th century literature. But Boilat was bold enough to suggest that Africans had a civilization just as important as the civilization of Europeans. For instance, he told young Africans, Christians, that they really should not feel humble to be Christians and think that Europeans gave them a gift. Now that is a counter-discourse right there, because the discourse of the missionaries of the church was that the church was bringing God to people who were heathens, and therefore saving their souls. And he said, no, don't feel bad. You may have gotten lost over the centuries, but you were there from the beginning. And he would tell them in a speech, and the speech is reprinted, he reprinted it in Esquisse Sénégalaise. Do you know that Saint Augustine was an African? One of you, he would say. And he was among the first Christians. So, of course, Christianity went from Africa to Europe. It's your birthright. You should not be astonished or ashamed. Only you should be proud to learn enough about your own history. Now, that whole discourse of trying to reconcile the African person with his or her past, we didn't hear that discourse coming out under the pen, through the pen of Africans until negritude. And that is like in the 1940s, 50s, really, when Senghor and his colleagues began writing very strong essays about a revindication of Africans. At that time, we did not know that Cheikh Anta Diop, the famous historian, Egyptologist, will show and go on to prove that the culture and the civilization of ancient Egypt is truly black African. So again, in that sense, Boilat was ahead of his time. And in any case, the discourse suggesting that Africans were first Christians, true as it may be, was revolutionary and dangerous for him to make, but he did. He looked at African philosophers and he said, oh, they say Africans don't have a philosophy, but I can tell you about at least 3 people that I have done research on who were very, very important philosophers, great thinkers. And he proceeded in his book to collect and comment and print their statements. One of them, one of the first, was Cochabamba. Cochabamba Fall is known in Senegal today and is praised and studied by many. Youssou N'Dour, the Senegalese international pop star, just came out with a new song a couple of years ago about Cochabamba. Senegalese painters who do popular painting have painted images of Cochabamba whom they have never seen, of course. A day does not go by in a city in Senegal when someone does not pepper a speech with quotations from Cochabamba. This is a philosophy for life. It's not a philosophy for an ivory tower. You might say the philosophy that might correspond to it perhaps would be that of Lao Tzu, Confucius, who made very pungent statements also in his time in China. Or if you like, and you're a student of French literature, you might benefit by reading the La Rochefoucauld, who also wrote maxims. These statements by Cochabamba were like maxims, but he did not make the statements as maxims. They were couched in speeches. However, the speeches got lost, and what remained with people was the conclusion of the story. Okay. Abbé Boilat did research, and in doing research, he talked to people around Saint Louis, and he went to the courts of the kings of Senegal, where he knew he could find very learned people, both literate and illiterate. People who had studied Arabic, for example, in the 19th century, and there were many who wrote letters for the kings. They served as secretaries for the kings. This is not a new thing in Africa, by the way. In medieval times, in Timbuktu, today in the newspapers you find lots of stories about the great libraries of Timbuktu kept by families. They're all written in Arabic letters, sometimes in African languages using Arabic script. So the writing was there. It didn't come with Europeans, you see. So Boilat would talk to these, we call them in Senegal, these are clerics, called marabout. And he would talk to them and say, tell me about Cochabamba or Biram Penda and others. And he would say, they would tell him a statement of Cochabamba, and he would ask them to comment. And they would develop it, much in the same way that we give a philosophical subject to a student and ask the student to comment. He would take notes. He gathered all these notes and wrote a very important chapter in Esquisse Sénégalaise on these Senegalese philosophers. One of the statements of the philosopher Cochabamba is nit sagu. Nit in the Wolof language means the human being, a person. Sago is a term that cannot be translated with just one word. It is the other complex part of the two-word statement. Sago is what makes a person fully a person. It is that which creates balance in a person. Not too hot, not too cold, not too passionate, again, not too cold. Somebody who doesn't go, who doesn't act in an excessive way, who knows how to keep excess at bay, but still enjoys everything. Someone in whose presence everybody feels at ease. You might say it's perhaps an ideal among the Wolof people to reach that state. But Cochabamba thought that some people had, in fact, reached that stage. So Nit Sago is a statement that has been commented by many Senegalese philosophers. Hassan Silla is one of them. And it is a statement attributed to Cochabamba. Many, many other statements are attributed to him. Cochabamba did prove that such philosophers existed, and he even said one could possibly write a big, huge book of their statements, which he never had time to do. But to this day, people in Senegal learn about their own culture by reading what Boilat had written. He also talked about literature. He said, people think when they see Africans, Wolof, sitting down and talking, that they're just chatting away, talking about unimportant things. But I can tell you that their meetings are comparable to the meetings of a learned society in France, sitting in a salon and commenting a book. Then he proceeds to explain the subjects they deal with, the mental agility that is required to understand some of the statements that they were discussing and developing amongst themselves. He wrote down folk tales, translated them, and commented them. In that regard also, he was a pioneer. To my knowledge, Boilat was the first one who employed the scientific method which we have inherited today among anthropologists, folklorists, literature, oral literature study scholars, which consists in taking down a statement made in an African language, word for word, in the original language, providing a translation word for word of the statement, then commenting it, then providing a second level translation destined for those who only speak French or English. This is the way now that oral traditions have been studied for a long time now. I have found no one before Boilat who had used this method. But he was a grammarian, and he had the tools of linguistics to do it, and the patience, and he knew the importance of writing it down as it was said. His own mentor, Baron Roger, who was a former governor of Senegal, a Frenchman, a man of literature, was impressed by Senegalese folktales, and he took some down, and he translated them. I was fascinated when I discovered his book, Fables Sénégalaises. But I found that he stifled the literature by forcing it to resemble French fables. His model was Jean de La Fontaine. So he took every folktale and wrote it down in rhyme, in verse, to be like Jean de La Fontaine's. So therefore, at the end, he had to draw the moral lesson, which Boilat says you never do in a Wolof folktale. Who draws the moral lesson? The audience, not the storyteller. So therefore, he betrayed the originality that could be found in those stories. Boilat did not follow his mentor in that regard. He followed the scientific method, which is universally applied today. In all these regards, Boilat was ahead of his time. And in conclusion, I will say, so that we leave room for conversation, that Boilat was indeed a man of the cloth. And as such, he owed his loyalty to the church, and he obeyed the church. But at the same time, he felt compelled to defend and illustrate African culture, the African culture that he grew to know best, and to illustrate it as a culture worthy of study and worthy of admiration, just like any other culture. Thank you for your patience.